Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, and good afternoon to everybody. I would like to welcome you all to this panel discussion on the future of higher education as part of the School of Tomorrow conference of Beacon House School System. I have a very distinguished panel with me today, and I would like to briefly introduce them to you. I have with me Dr. Adil Najam, who's the Dean of Pardee School for Global Studies at Boston University. I have Dr. Faisal Bari, who's Interim Dean of School of Education at the Lahore University of Management Sciences. I have Mr. Stavros Yiannouka, who's the CEO of WISE Qatar, and Dr. Shirley Congdon, who's the Vice Chancellor of Bradford University. And finally, we have Mr. Yasser Bashir, who's the CEO of Arbisoft in Lahore, Pakistan. We have a very interesting panel question before us. Would universities serve? And I would like to open this discussion with Dr. Adil Najam, who has been doing a very interesting project at Boston University, looking at basically what happens after COVID-19. So with that, Adil, what are your thoughts about what happens after COVID-19? Can you tell us a little bit about the project and the general sort of lessons that you learned from that, and then what specifically about higher education?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and wonderful to be with this great panel. A few quick thoughts would be just on the basic premise of the question, if you would. I think one lesson is that there is no after COVID. I have used this term myself and now come to regret it, because it assumes that there is a before COVID, and then there is the little period when COVID happens, and then there is a world that happens after that. It's now clear that's not the case. It's not the case for nearly anything. It's certainly not the case for higher education. And what that means is that there is a change that is happening now. It is not like sort of we are in a holding pattern right now, and after this, we will either come back or start at a new point. There is a transformation that is happening, will be happening, and there is no return, importantly, to a before COVID world. That will create challenges, but it will also create opportunities. But this notion that this is just sort of a storm and then we'll come out of the storm and be in a new place suddenly or an old place is not correct. The second part of, if I can look at the big contention, the question that you had started with, will universities survive? They will clearly survive. They've survived 1,000 years. They will survive now. What is also clear is they will not look like what they look like. And that's the key thing. The key question is not whether they'll be there or not. The key question is, what will they look like? This is not a moment of dealing with a crisis. This is a moment of transformation. And particular universities may not remain. Many new universities or new institutions or ideas or thoughts will come up. The strong ones will survive. But essentially, whatever the continuity was, and to whatever extent, gets a very clear and big shift, and that again provides opportunities and it creates challenges. Very briefly, in terms of lessons that we are learning, not just for universities in the US but across the world, I think three are worth highlighting just in headline format as we begin. One, and most importantly, is just like the disease. The impact of the disease is just like the disease. So like in COVID, we keep hearing that those with existing conditions are most at risk. Exactly the same thing is true for institutions, for countries, just like for individuals. So whatever were the existing pathologies, maladies of the higher education sector have come out in a heightened form because of the crisis. It is not the crisis has caused new problems. Some it has, like travel and congregation, but it has intensified all the weaknesses or all the strengths also that were there in the sector beforehand. For example, I have argued, and I know this is somewhat controversial, there has been an oversupply of higher education, and that oversupply has caused a crisis of quality. that the number of people in higher education, and we've usually said what a wonderful thing it is, but it is only wonderful if it has quality. And that mismatch has been there for a whole number of years. It's certainly there in Pakistan. But it's also here in the US, it's clearly there in Europe, and others can talk about it, because sort of this rush to educate very large numbers of people with a system that always hasn't been able to provide quality, whether in the form of the faculty or even in the form of the students. And therefore, you have on the skill side this issue that employers keep raising, that the degree, if you will, the parchment no longer matches the expectations. And this in Pakistan is very clear, right? So you get someone who says he has or she has a bachelor's degree, you assume that they have certain skills. And again and again and again, you find they do not have those skills. Right. So again, this I'm making a big, bold statement, but there are many other things like this. There was the even bigger one is the crisis of cost that was already there. The cost of higher education bloated to extreme events in the US, causing massive student debts. Partly because of the type of things demanded, partly because we have a very costly model of instruction and so on and so forth. So all of those issues, and whatever they were in different parts of the world, came in. The second big lesson is, like in everything, technology is a major thing, but technology is not a clear-cut winner or loser. In fact, we have seen the strength of technology as every university turned into Zoom University, literally overnight. Within 1 week, we at our university did not lose a single day of class, and shifted immediately. Not a single day of class, the entire class graduated on time and quickly turned to Zoom. Now that was in some ways a very major revelation for many people, but it also sort of highlighted the limitations of online and other technologies. That it isn't the same thing to be in a class, to make the eye contact. This is not about gadgets and gizmos. Good online education is extremely expensive. Good online education is extremely difficult. It is not simply getting in front of Zoom and doing it, much like seminars. So we've seen the implication of that. A very small artifact is that 5 weeks ago, the market capitalization of Zoom, listen to this carefully, market capitalization of Zoom was greater than the combined market capitalization of the 7 largest airlines in the world. But at the same time, we found the limitations of Zoom. We found sort of it is not the same. And then the question from a perspective of a student is, if I can get YouTube for $100 a year, why am I paying $50,000 a year to watch professors giving a lecture on online? And that question confronts universities in very real ways, goes back to the budget and the financial model, and new technologies will emerge. Existing technologies, many are, but technology again a major factor, but not clear. Winners and losers in some ways. There is an army of students out there. There is an army of faculty out there missing the classroom, recognizing again the value of that small community of learning by immersion, right? Unless you're doing just skill and sort of, information rather than knowledge. On the other hand, there is an army out there that have suddenly realized the potential of these two things, and that will be harbinger of change. And finally, I think the importance or otherwise of brands in education. In a way, higher education has been the most important brand. It's more than Gucci, more than whatever other brands, Ferrari. It has been a game of brands, and that comes both as a revelation, but also how strong that is, and especially if you are in that middle tier of higher education, or if you are a choice maker as a student. You start confronting those questions here. What am I getting out of this? But there are also opportunities, and what we see is, because the higher education sector is so big, those opportunities are not equally divided. So a lot of universities are clearly coming out of this much stronger, either because they have a very strong brand or because they had pre-existing strengths in technology or other areas, and others find themselves faltering. A study here in the US suggests that within 5 years, upwards of 650 colleges and universities in the US will no longer exist. On the other hand, some of the ones that will survive will thrive and be much bigger. So those are the three type of very big things that across the globe, I think at the highest level are happening, but there are others too.
Okay, thank you very much. These were several very important points, very well made, and we'll come back to them. Shirley, I just want to put you on the spot and say one of the statements that Adil made is that these are essentially accentuating the existing conditions. So what COVID-19 is doing is that it is actually making the weaknesses that were already existing in the universities become more accentuated. Would you agree with this in the UK sort of higher education context, or do you think you are seeing something different?
Thank you. I would largely agree that definitely what we're seeing is something that is a continuum. So I think it is definitely the case that we were already needing to see changes in higher education. And the need for those changes did centre on things like value for money, quality research needing to be further enhanced, and differentiation across the sector. We see universities that have got better cash reserves, that are stronger financially. But I think I definitely agree with the issue of it's a continuum. I think that will obviously put many universities in a different position. However, some of the stronger universities have been impacted by things associated with third stream income, where they've got large student accommodation. And as the confidence perhaps in the international market declines, those students won't want to travel perhaps internationally. And if there is a quality offer which can be delivered in a very interactive, quality, interesting way online, then that might persuade students to want to remain in their home country and study if the offer is quality as described by Adil. I think the issue of oversupply is interesting, and I'm not entirely in agreement that there's an oversupply. And the reason I'm not is because I'm absolutely committed to universities playing their part in social mobility and social inclusion. And this raises the important issue over how do we still address access and participation and narrowing the gaps in achievement. Now, I believe universities have got a great role to play in making sure that as many people as possible can access quality education, rather than perhaps in the UK, what we've seen just this week is our ministers suggesting that further education is the place where these other individuals perhaps might be better suited. So I think we've got to think very carefully, but I do think value for money is important. But we must not ever forget the impact that universities did have and will have if they can adapt further on social and economic growth. And we must ensure that universities are the place where the education is well designed, research-led, research-informed, innovative, linked to industry, in order that the criticisms that Adil mentioned, that sometimes industry isn't satisfied with the quality of the graduates, this means our programs must be always co-designed with our business partners. And if there's a program that isn't co-designed, then it's not going to be relevant. And we must focus on high-level skills and research entrepreneurialism, and be more flexible, not have single start dates. So I think there's big challenges put out on higher education. But as Adil said, I agree, these challenges were already emerging. COVID-19 is just forcing us to think about them more rapidly and innovate more quickly than perhaps we would have done.
Okay, I'd like to move to Stavros. Stavros, Adil says that there were existing conditions, that are being accentuated. From your perspective, do you think are those existing conditions related to particularly just the use of technology and the technology readiness, or are there other existing conditions that have been accentuated because of this? And how do you think innovation can sort of help bridge this divide?
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be with everyone on this panel. Well, let me begin first of all by agreeing with both Adil and Shirley that I think it'd be unwise, for anyone to bet against the traditional university. I mean, this is a model that's been with us from pretty much from late antiquity. I think the first sort of recognizably modern university was set up in Cairo in 900 AD, and fast forward 1,100 years later, and they're still very much with us. In fact, you could argue that the last 30 or 40 years has seen a flourishing and an explosion of higher education around the world as more and more countries have joined the ranks of middle-income countries. We've seen a remarkable increase in demand for higher education. I think, though, what we're seeing now, and again, I agree that some of these factors were present in the past. What we're seeing now that is being challenged, and that challenge has been brought into stark relief by the pandemic, is the link between higher education and employment opportunities. And there, I think we're going to see higher education institutions having to work much harder to demonstrate that they can add value in this. And I want to point to perhaps maybe three innovation trends that we're seeing that I think are going to make life difficult for higher education institutions. Again, I want to emphasize that doesn't mean that the traditional university is finished. Far from it. There will always be a place for high quality, research-led institutions of higher learning. But I think what we're going to see is a culling of programs and perhaps institutions whose sole proposition was come to us, get a degree, and you're set and you're ready for the workplace. I think that, they're going to have to work a lot harder to persuade and convince that they're delivering. So what are the three trends that are going to challenge this? The first is micro-credentialing platforms. Platforms like one of the earliest WISE Award winners, Allison, that provide, a direct link between the training that you get and the micro-credentials that you get, and opportunities, for employers to test your skills in that arena and potentially offer you a job. I think campus light universities, I like to call them, like Minerva, that was launched a few years ago in San Francisco. They offer a very high quality liberal arts education at a fraction of the cost of what you would have to pay, at least in the US, for an analogous degree. Again, I would watch that space, because it is a demonstration that it is possible to offer high quality without having to carry a large cost base in the form of a campus. And then finally, slightly perhaps more futuristic, the augmented reality, virtual reality space, which again may start bridging the gap between in-person tuition, in-person training, in-person education, and technology. I mean, one of the big downsides of the current state of our technology is it is a little impersonal. And I think AR and VR may offer the possibility of bridging that divide. It will also make possible the offering of fairly high cost, high, shall we say, touch training at a lower price. So, for example, we already know of universities using AR and VR to provide virtual labs, simulations of medical procedures, other things that in the past would have required massive investment on the part of universities to set up, say, medical schools, or scientific labs. Again, this isn't going to eliminate, no one here is suggesting that you're going to be able to do a medical residency purely on the basis of a VR or AR simulation. But much like pilots today, do not simply jump into the cockpit unless they have, X amount of hours on a flight simulator. Pretty soon, I think you'll be able to offer at least the early stages of, say, medical training, and other expensive types of training using simulations. So I think these are trends that universities need to look out for. They could very well adopt them, though, and that may well be the answer to remaining competitive. I'll stop there.
Great. So it seems like, technology remains a very important disrupting force here. And I would like to bring Yasser into this conversation. So Yasser, what kind of edtech trends are you seeing? Will platforms like edX and Coursera, for example, become synchronous, or do you see some others coming up, like an educational version of Zoom? And what are the current gaps and failings of the technology that is available to the university to be able to cope up with the challenge that we are facing today?
So thank you, Athar. Again, privileged to be part of this distinguished panel. Just to confirm some of the things that others said, Adil talked about, Zoom's popularity. I think edX recently broke into the top 1,000 websites of the world. Anant Agarwal, who's the edX CEO founder, he said in one of his public talks that they were seeing 10 times the traffic that they were seeing pre-COVID days. I think others have similar numbers. Khan Academy have said that they are seeing 300 to 500% increase in traffic. Coursera similar and all that. So there's a definite increase in traffic to all of these platforms. In terms of the technological trends, I think the change that platforms like edX and Coursera and other MOOC platforms will bring, the biggest change I see is the unbundling of education. So what I mean by that is, let's say you're a student going to a university to do a program in computing. If you have taken Harvard CS50 and, like Stavros said, have also received some form of micro-credentials, it is going to be increasingly possible for the university to accept that credit, because the universities are also recognizing that perhaps their own intro to computing course is not as good as Harvard CS50. Similarly, if you're a university that's going to teach a program in AI, it would not be very beneficial if you create an intro to AI program that does not exceed what, let's say, Andrew Ng's Coursera course in AI teaches you, because millions of students around the world already take that course and give it a 5-star rating. So I see the boundaries between when university starts and when university ends becoming blurred. Students, when they come to university, will have already done a bunch of online things, and after they leave the university, they'll be continuing to do those things, and many of those will be increasingly acceptable by the universities themselves. And this unbundling may not just happen at the level of the degree. I think technology will enable this unbundling to happen even at a level of the course. So let's say you want to design a new course in a new discipline, let's say biomedical engineering. You will be able to take snippets of lessons from resources around the world, YouTube videos, maybe some Coursera course, maybe some edX module, combine them into a new course and create that. So that will kind of unbundle the course itself, where you can have a course which where constituent parts are coming from around the world. So that unbundling is one big trend that I see. I would want to agree with the other commentators, though, that the universities are here to stay. And what I see happening in the future is that the best of universities and the best of technology will stay. Anything below the median for universities has something to worry about. But similarly, anything below the median for technology, subpar technology, has something to worry about as well. So what is, the best of what the universities offer? I mean, two things are infrastructure and equipment. So 15 years ago in a graduate program at Stanford, the kind of equipment that was available to me, it's still not available in Pakistan. So only large corporations or very well-funded universities can afford that. Things like, equipment for robotics experimentations, experimental physics, or haptics. I mean, those things are just not going to be available. And the community aspect that Adil talked about, especially chance encounters that you have with other qualified people, are something that technology cannot provide for you. So that is the best of university. That will be there to stay. The best of technology are things that technology does in a fundamentally better way compared with what you can do with traditional education. And one, we've had many conversations about this, and I sound like a broken record talking about that. Is one area is assessments, right? So I just want to quote the example of this fresh graduate hiring test that we do every year to hire people at our organization. 4,000 people from 40 plus universities take that exam simultaneously. It's randomized. It's every question, it's a computer science GRE style exam, right? So every question gets a unique generation of itself for each individual students. Now, even if I had a very large auditorium that could fit 4,000 people, there's no way I can do that. And this allows me to increase the credibility of whether the students solve the exam themselves or not. So I feel like that's a huge area, assessments. We know that the adaptive GRE test was immediately an improvement over the paper-based GRE test because it can adapt to the students' unique capabilities. So assessments is a big example of technology where technology does something fundamentally better than traditional education. And another example, just to second what Stavros said, is if you're studying human anatomy, there's no way picking up Gray's Anatomy and going through the book compares with the experience of wearing a headset and maybe traveling through the human body, looking at all of the organs and parts. So that experience is just fundamentally better. So the best of technology will stay in the new world, and the best of university will stay, and hopefully they will be blended in interesting ways. And I see that as the de facto higher education model going forward once we are over this pandemic. And I also want to agree with everybody that the pandemic has only accelerated what was already written on the wall.
Great. So I think several interesting ideas. Faisal, you get to have the last say on this issue of whether the current scenario accentuates the failings of our current existing university system, and also talk a little bit about particularly in terms of your university alums. How are universities thinking of opening up, and how is the planning happening for bringing this kind of best of university and best of technology, components together in a university in Pakistan, for instance?
Thank you, first. It's a privilege to be here. Let me just say where I think this is the important question, is this COVID, it's pushed us into thinking very hard about what the nature of the boundaries of a university are. I think it's very true, those boundaries are going to change. This takes me back to a 1937 article by Ronald Coase, one of the Nobel winners, who at that time had asked what are the boundaries of a firm. And the answer crucially depended on things like technology, the decreasing cost, economies of scale, the cost of transactions, and so on. And so if technology brings down the cost substantially in an area, then clearly that is going to change the boundary of that particular, in this case, not a firm, but a university. So if a university can provide reasonable quality to a global market, and then they will compete globally. The markets no longer remain fragmented geographically, but become much larger. And then the players try to take benefit from those much larger markets. So, for example, what's stopping a Stanford, Harvard, or the branded products that Adil talked about. What stops them from offering degree programs in Pakistan, India, or wherever, if they can come up with a good pricing model, and with technology coming down, if the pricing model does get competitive, then it happens. And so that's the pressure that partly will come with online learning getting more accepted, that, and with platforms getting better, people thinking that it's a competitive good, and the distance between physically present teaching or learning is not too large compared to the online one. If that happens, then the online education becomes a lot more competitive, and at some price point, it becomes possible for people to switch from their, let's say, neighborhood university to a global program being offered by one of the branded products. Now, here the cost comparison is very important, because Harvard, for example, charges something like $50,000, whereas a lot of public sector universities in Pakistan might be charging $1,000 or $2,000 a year. So if you're thinking that Harvard is going to offer degrees to the students of that university, you have to carefully think that is there that kind of a price differential that Harvard has to cover to allow for to come to students at the level of that local university. I don't know how much technology and the economies of scale, etc., will allow that, and to that extent, I think the market might get limited. The other side I keep saying is, keep thinking is that, is the product standardized or not? I mean, if you really think that an economics degree from Harvard is the same as an economics degree which happens in India or Pakistan, is it a standard burger that everyone eats? If it's a standard burger, then yes, you can provide that across the world. But if universities offer very unique products that are contextualized, that are in tune with the local market, then it's very hard to see. Then, of course, the fragmentation remains to a certain extent, and it's not one market then. So a lot of the universities will have to carefully think about how do they contextualize, localize, how do they brand themselves in terms of that kind of knowledge. And for subjects that do offer, for example, whether it be cultural studies or a number of other areas that do require substantial localization, and then those niches will definitely appear. For subjects there is very little localization, or it thought to be no localization. Those might become much more globalized in some ways. In Pakistan, the problem is slightly different. One problem, Adil was saying there's an oversupply of higher education. I mean, I'm not so sure of that argument. With a population of 220 million, Pakistan has only 200 odd universities right now. I was saying that 200 might be too many as well. Well, then the size of those universities might have to change, because those 200 combined together offer only 7.5% people a chance to get to higher education. In many countries, the comparable numbers might be 15, 20%, and sometimes even more. So I'm not sure what oversupply means, but it is true that higher education demand has expanded very rapidly. And on the supply side, I think we are still scrambling very hard to keep up with the demand in Pakistan. And that gap, which shows up both on quality and in terms of numbers, etc., is still there. It was there in schooling about 10 years ago, and then it got covered by a lot by private schooling. But here in university, that gap is still there. Universities are still scrambling and trying to create the right quality, pricing, and program mix, etc. And in comes this COVID, which will change a lot of these things because of the technology pressure as well. So my feeling is that the higher education sector across the world, but in Pakistan also, will continue to be in disequilibrium for quite some time before it is clear what a more equilibrium sort of situation that arises. There are also problems in Pakistan because of very different infrastructure, and so the market might be much more fragmented than some of the other countries, in the sense that online learning depends a lot more on on the internet and an infrastructure that is distributed across a population. Now, with poverty rates where they are, with the ability of people to have a decent environment at home, in which by decent I mean a place to sit, a computer, some quiet time, some of the other requirements, which for a very large number in Pakistan might not be possible. So really looking at whether online education becomes a viable alternative or not is not just about pricing, it's about on the receiving side, it's about that customer or whoever, the recipient also. And we have to see what the situation of the recipient is. And there also, I think we will find that the market is very fragmented in Pakistan and will continue to remain so. So I think where adjustment is going to happen, I still am not sure how quickly it will happen and how large an adjustment it will be in terms of changing the number of universities, etc., for Pakistan at least.
Yeah, Shirley, do you see this kind of strategic planning mindset in the universities in the UK, for instance? Really thinking about what their core strength is. What kind of service can be provided at what cost, and what would stay and what would go. Do you see that kind of strategic planning, or do you see more of, okay, I need to get classes online right now, and and make the university sort of come back online? How do you see the UK system is responding?
No. Yeah, I think the UK system is definitely taking a response that is centred on understanding their relative strengths. I think the differentiation in the different universities has been heightened because of COVID-19, but as we were all saying, they were different anyway. But I think people are now going to be building upon their relative strengths. They've got to. And people are looking at their programmes very carefully and making sure that they are that they can carry them. I think universities will not be carrying unviable programmes. We were already going through a process of making sure that the programmes that were delivered were the programmes that were people needed and were high quality and were digitally enabled. But the point that Dr. Bari made about the inequalities in access to IT is significantly the same across the UK. And some universities that are centred in the middle of cities which are relatively socioeconomically deprived are definitely seeing households with multiple occupancy and lack of access to not just the internet but to computing facilities. So many students might just have their mobile phone, which isn't sufficient to access VR and AR and all of the things that we've been talking about. So I think people see the pivot to using Zoom and Teams, etc., right across the whole of their offer as a temporary pivot, but they're working out what the more strategic pivot would be to offer a more blended approach.
Yeah. Okay, Adil, do you have any thoughts on equity, both regional as well as intra-regional equity? Do small universities in the developing world get to gain from this disruption? Are we seeing something like, the Clayton Christensen's, disruption effect in the higher education, where potentially a lower quality service gets started and then it includes the excluded, but then becomes the mainstream? So if you're going to see more of the involvement of technology and lowering of cost because of technology, there's a potential that higher education may become accessible to people who are not able to afford it right now. So do you think, are we seeing those kinds of effects, or are we going to see those kind of effects?
So clearly there is disruption, and disruption is such a nasty word. We talk about it, especially tech folks, as if it's such a nice thing. It's not. Disruption essentially means jobs. Let's be very honest about this. When we say technology will come, what we really mean is many people will lose jobs, right? Especially all these IT technologies. That's what they do. We say, okay, instead of people training you, we will now have an AI or a machine. So first of all, let's be very clear on that. But you are right. I think there is a lot of opportunity, especially in the immediate term with COVID. I don't know about the long term, but in the immediate term, and that is because primarily of the mobility that higher education has required, the model we have of very large number of students traveling internationally. Just simply that, a lot of students are thinking of taking gap years. The US visa policy is forcing that even more than COVID. But the visa policy coming out of COVID is forcing many students to think, okay, maybe I don't want to go to a different country in this time of turmoil. And there is an immediate opportunity in there, not only for national, but for regional universities. You see that in the advertising, in the activities of universities trying to gain a market share. Now, if they are smart and in gaining that market share, they also gain quality and reputation, that could be a more longer term thing. So that sort of opportunities is in any turmoil, there will be opportunities for newer players to up the game because space opens up. But the access and equity question, I want to link, my colleagues have been very, very polite in maybe rightly disagreeing with me on the supply side. So I think that's where it's related. My supply argument is related to quality, right? In the last round, I and everyone talked about the economics of it. The reason I say oversupply, and maybe the term is wrong, but what I mean is the number of university slots and universities available is far smaller than the number of qualified, quality, educated individuals being produced. Because of this demand, we are meeting it with bad quality education, certainly in Pakistan. But not just in Pakistan, even the highest branded universities. You know, we keep saying Harvard and stuff. I am no longer sure if the very top universities in the world, if a student comes, I now want to interview them and find out. Because all universities have been propelled by this sort of glut of students wanting to come and money coming with them, right? So, you know, countries start schemes where they will pay students to do a PhD. That changes the dynamic of the receiving university. So what I'm saying is, I agree with Shirley and everyone on social mobility, but the cost of social mobility has been increased by universities. So the here in the US, they say, or maybe even in Pakistan, that a bachelor's is the new high school. The same job that used to be someone could get after high school, now they require a bachelor's for, and it is not any longer clear, not just to employer, but to me as an educator. If that student after 16 years is trained any better than they could have been after 12. So I can imagine a different model where education quality increases, but there are fewer universities that are doing far more intense education for those who want to go there, but social mobility is not checked. This assumption that social mobility must only come with a degree. The whole point of micro credentials, I think, is that it's going to, if that is the future, it bypasses this argument that I need a BA, MA, PhD, whatever in front of my name. Right now, I say that with grave concern. Because the equity question is not simply if you are in university or not. The equity question should be, do I get quality education if I go to universities? I am not sure with the type of sort of glut there is, that is always true. And in many ways, I hope one of the impacts of this COVID will be a renewed focus, not just on cost, but on quality, right? So let's take the 50,000 price tag. The 50,000 price tag can mean two things. I can do most of these on YouTube for free. So why am I going there? Or it can lead to, which is a cost argument. Or it can lead to a quality argument, which is, am I getting 50,000 worth of quality? If you are, then it's a very good deal. Right? If you are, then it's a very good deal. The responsibility of us universities is to match the quality, rather than become essentially credentialing agencies, which at some point, you know, this argument that Faisal and others rightly make, you know, is 7% in higher in graduate education too high a number or too low a number? I don't think a higher number is necessarily always very good. If you give me education at the secondary level that is good, that creates people, that gives them fulfilling livelihoods, but also fulfilling intellectual space after 12 years, then why do you want to put them 4 years more in my classroom? So what I'm saying is, if you think about the whole pipeline, we education itself should be re-questioned and new opportunities found for quality. But quality to me is the yardstick. I
Shirley,
know
I
I'm
think you want to make a quick point?
Yeah, well, just the pipeline from, cradle to grave of education is really important, and we have to have it right at the intersections and the point at which people move from one part, primary, secondary, further education, higher education. No universities want to set students up to fail. We do not want to be admitting students who can't cope with the demands of the course. But what we often find is the entry levels are being set here, when actually, do we really understand what the correct requirements are to cope with the demands of the course? So I think the whole thing does need to be looked at. But how do we judge people's capability to engage in higher education? It therefore questions what do they need to engage with debate, synthesis, analysis. And it may be that they don't have the highest level of qualifications for entry because of the experiences they've had at home and at school. The lack of social and cultural capital will have impacted on people. But it doesn't mean to say that they can't engage in this if the relative support systems are there. And I think this is what's been sort of discussed here, really. If universities are meant to be open and wanting to be accessible, then if people come without the formal high level of qualification, then we have to be set up differently to support those with the raw ability to think and engage in debate, to be able to articulate it in the way we expect it traditionally to be done at universities, in the format that we think. And it would be really terrible if we got into a position where we dismissed intelligence. It's almost a debate about what do we class as intelligence and the ability to innovate and be entrepreneurial. And sometimes that does come from many, many people across the world who've never crossed the door of a university. So we must be very careful, I think, about thinking about the talent that you need and the ability to think and problem solve. Sorry, I'm ranting a little bit.
No, that's okay. Faisal, you want to make a point?
I just wanted to push back a little because I think, if for everyone, Adil made the argument that, look, there's a special reason why we go to a university, and that education must give something that is what we can do at high school. We should definitely, and if the quality is high enough, we definitely don't need to do at the university, and then maybe the numbers don't need to be the same. The problem is historically, whenever that kind of an argument gets operationalized, it always works against the poor and against those who are at the bottom of the rung. And so I'm just very wary of that kind of argument going forward in Pakistan, because it's the same thing. When you talk about technical education being introduced, it's always the poor person's son or daughter who gets into technical education. It's always, when you restrict the numbers, the rich person will always get their child into the university, and it's going to be the poor person who's going to suffer. So either we get the operationalization of that idea also very well. It's a global trend that there is escalation, and now everyone goes for bachelor's or higher. There are countries in this world where even university education is moving towards being declared as a basic right, even though constitutions have done high school. But in the East, there are countries that are now saying that a bachelor's is a basic right, because without that, you can't make a good living. So in that kind of a divided frame, to make the argument of oversupply and to partially have something like that imposed is going to create even more problems in the equity field. So we just want to be wary of that operationalization. Athar's mic might have, Athar's internet connection might have stopped.
So we are getting a lot of questions online, and I want to get to the questions, as well. So I'll throw a couple of questions at probably Yasser and Stavros. So people are asking about, whether the cost of online education is the same as the cost of, blended learning and the cost of in-person education. We've sort of experienced this thing, that schools, as they've moved to online education, at least in the short term, have sort of kept their fees at the same level. I know Harvard day before yesterday announced that their fee, while their whole next year is going to move online, but the fee is going to remain the same. Can you comment a little bit about that? And also, people are asking about the future of distance learning, and do you see universities getting more in the area of distance learning? And also, do you think a university degree would be required for software experts, for example? So a whole bunch of questions, but somewhat related.
So I think I can take the second one of those, and then I'd be happy to have Stavros maybe take up the first one. I do want to make a quick comment as a technologist to something that Dr. Adil said, which is that technology takes away jobs and does not create jobs. I have to vehemently disagree with that, because I feel like even in this pandemic situation, I feel like the jobs that have remained are, the entire kind of on-demand economy is a result of technology, and that's the only one that's keeping people busy on a large scale. So the Paikias and the Kareems of the world. Anyway, I think that's a different discussion. So coming back to that question, I feel like in terms of learning skills, online is not only very cost effective and strongly recommended. Employers are now increasingly accepting credentials from online sources. So I know that Google's and the Microsofts of the world did away for their requirement for a degree. And that's actually one of my, if I wear my employer hat, that's one of my primary beefs. I feel like universities are often trying to teach skills and they shouldn't. A computer science professor who's, spent 20 years teaching algorithms should not be trying to teach how to develop iPhone applications. That's the job of a Udacity, and a Udacity does it much better and much, much more cost effectively. So you can go and do an iPhone development nano degree, which is a pretty well recognized and respected credential around the world now, even at my organization, even at Google and Microsoft, if you want to learn iPhone development. But if you're going to do algorithms, if you're going to do theory, some of the things that others have talked about, which mandate a university, then don't rely exclusively on a Coursera or an edX. So I feel like that distinction will become clearer and clearer. For skills, technology will be the de facto standard. Everybody will start accepting the credentials. Whether the cost actually compares with the university, absolutely not. If you do a micro master's program from edX today, and you get admitted into a graduate program at MIT, I believe 50% of the first year's credit is adjusted against your MicroMasters. The cost of that MicroMasters is something like $1,200 or maybe $1,500. The cost of spending half a year at a university to complete the same credit hours is $25,000. So I think, like we've all said, the ideal model in the future is blended, where what universities can teach well, they should double down on it. What technology can teach well, it should double down on it.
Yeah, Stavros?
Yeah, so just on the first question, I mean, in terms of the cost structure of universities, the cost structure of universities compared to that of, of schools, I think in some ways universities are at a greater disadvantage because they often carry non-education related overhead in the form of, for example, dorms and other services that they offer to students who are required sort of to be on campus. So, the issue of whether, universities can and, reduce fees given that the offering is now moved online, I think the answer is at least from an economic and financial standpoint, no. They can't, because they're carrying a significant fixed and semi-fixed cost. How this kind of works itself out, over the long term remains to be seen. If I could just take, one moment also now to just comment a little bit on some of the issues raised that, I think there was a rich enough discussion to fill several panels in my view. But, from Adil's standpoint of oversupply, I would rather think of it more in terms of qualifications inflation, which you've actually alluded to, Adil. I think the issue isn't so much over or under supply of higher education. It's that demand has grown exponentially because of perhaps, and that has driven qualifications inflation. And there's a great book that came out, I think 9 years ago, from Hugh Lauder and a couple of other academics, called The Global Auction, The Broken Promise of Higher Education, essentially documenting empirically how qualifications inflation, in a sense, is the outcome of greater enrollment in higher education. I think the other point that I think we ought to, and I don't mean on this panel, but as a sort of higher education industry focus on, is the degree to which higher education is now part of the problem of lack of social mobility, as opposed to playing its traditional role of being the solution. Harvard's been mentioned a few times here, and look, I'm sure the education at Harvard is terrific. Is it worth the fees? Probably not, if you look at it purely from the standpoint of what it is that you are learning. If you overlay, though, the signaling effect that a Harvard degree gives you, the networks that you buy into, so to speak, all of that kind of social capital that's embedded into a Harvard degree, then I would probably say you're getting pretty good value for money. Now, that in and of itself, though, is a problem, because you are essentially, creating a hierarchy of higher education based not on the quality of the education or the qualification, but simply on the luxury value of a brand, and that is in and of itself problematic, but goes in some ways beyond the remit of our discussion here. It's a broader social issue that I think needs to be thought about and addressed. I don't know if we've lost our moderator, but I'm done.
You stunned him into silence.
I think, I was supposed to take over once. Oh, Athar is back. Athar, are you back? So any concluding remarks from anyone who's especially... Athar, go ahead.
Okay, I'm back. So I'm told that we only have a minute left. I would have liked for everybody to have a final say on this, topic, but I would have to sort of really, in the last minute sum it up. I think our panel, if I'm not wrong, seems to suggest that, while some changes would happen, this is not the end of the university. The university will come back probably even stronger. I think Yasser made a very interesting point about, we seeing the best of both the university and the best of technology coming in. I think we still, sort of disagree on the, on the equity part of the question. It feels like, the cost structures of universities would probably remain the same, at least, at least for the time being. And also, Adil made a point about, there being oversupply of higher education, on which our panel couldn't agree. But this has been an excellent, discussion. I think some really interesting points made, and we all look forward to, seeing this COVID crisis through, and also, seeing the university flourish at the end of the COVID crisis. Thank you very much, everyone, for your time and your insights. It's been a great privilege to host this panel.
Thank you, everybody.